Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. So nice to be together, and here we are. We're on the other side, aren't we? The other side, namely, the transition to Mishkan Or has happened, and it seems smooth, even though a lot of work, a lot of effort and thought went into it. I thought last night was a really lovely celebration, and it's a thrill to be a part of this. I think that Rabbi Nosenchuk, who gave a wonderful sermon last night, the thing that rang most clearly in my own ears was this is both the oldest congregation in Cleveland and the newest. I thought that was a great insight. Whenever we come upon a wonderful moment, we don't allow it to pass without acknowledgement. So let's say a Shechianu together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu no, I blew it. Let's start again. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and enabled us to arrive at this precious moment. One of the ways in which rabbis every now and then come to recognize the possibility of their power is that when we start a blessing and go down the wrong path, people follow us. B'rei Priya Gofen for the Motzi. Everybody's fine with it. So it happens. Okay. So welcome to those who are new. Former Fairmont people, we're so glad to have you now. We're all one. So former Fairmont is a locution that we're going to be using less and less because now we are one. So we're all glad to be together. Some of you have asked the obvious question, how come we have two Torah study sessions at the same time? And I know it is a puzzle, but we have a reason for it. So eventually, and we're going to be moving gradually in this direction, we are going to be having on Shabbat morning, a variety of activities. So our tentative plan is to start the activities, of which there may be 3 or 4, at 9 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, all the participants will convene in the chapel for a service, after which we'll have something like a repast, some food together. So it's going to be a Shabbat morning celebration. If we were to start Torah study, let's say this Torah study at 9 o'clock and go to 10:30, and wait till 10:30 to start the next one, that would go until noon, and we wouldn't have the opportunity at 11 o'clock to come together. So I recognize some of the issues related to a variety of things at the same time. On the other hand, I think there's a good reason for it. We recognize that we are in a period of experimentation. We have 7 clergy. We have 2,000 member families. So we're in a position to do a lot of things. And we're going to experiment, explore possibilities. And that may entail some overlap, but people will be making choices. And I assume, for example, that some of you who are here this morning for this Torah study may want to explore Rabbi Nosenchuk's next week or the week after. I don't think we want to, how shall I go on with this? We don't want people to feel that they need to be loyal to one group or another. I think the fact that we have a variety of opportunities and a variety of teachers of Torah and other aspects of Judaism is a great plus for us, and I hope that we'll explore and get to know one another in a variety of venues. Okay, so also, thank you so much for coming at 9 o'clock. You got my email. That's one of the reasons we're starting at 9, so that we can be thinking about 9 to 10:30, 9 to 10:30 for these activities. And we'll be making some adjustments as we go along. I want to thank those who participated in our bagels venture. Some of you who are new, we have people sponsoring bagels, sponsoring live streaming, and welcome to those who are live streaming this morning. And we also have people picking up the bagels on Shabbat morning. And people who are here for the first time may want to participate in this. I was out. We didn't have Torah study last week, so I want to begin by thanking those who sponsored last week's bagels. Stuart Friedman, in honor of Arthur Kane's birthday. Thank you very much. Live streaming sponsored by Eric Shaw. Eric, thanks so much. And Pickup Marie Smith. That was last week. This week, bagels, live stream, and Pickup, all sponsored by Russell and Nancy Ben-Giat. Thank you so very, very much. We'll be available for a loan. Okay. I'm out of town next week. As some of you know, one of my brothers and I travel together a couple of times a year, spending a couple of days together, which is always a highlight for both of us, and next week is our week. So I have asked Enid Kushner to lead Torah study next week, and Enid has graciously accepted the invitation. So come and learn from Enid next week. Okay. For those of you who are here for the first time, I just want to reiterate what I usually say. And that is, if you can't make it at 9 o'clock, but only at 9:15, 9:20, 9:30, come. Nobody minds if you're late. And if you need to leave early, nobody minds if you leave early. It's important to me that you're here for the time that you can be here. And I know we all lead busy lives. So if you can only come for part of it, don't feel the least embarrassment. People get up and leave or come in late all the time. And I think it bothers nobody, least of all me. Also, bagels, of course, and coffee. Feel free anytime during the session to get right up and walk over there and get another bagel or another cup of coffee. What we're trying to do here is to have a stimulating time together, so we don't want to impose restrictions on us. I always notice, maybe only at this moment in a session, I have difficulty remembering to restate the questions for people at live stream. So my partner Jackie wrote this very large sign, restate questions, laminated. I'll put it right here, right in front of me, and summarily ignore it. Not intentionally. I get caught up in what we're doing, of course. Okay. Blessing for the study of Torah. And before we do it, since some of you are here for the first time, let me say something about blessings in general and this blessing in particular. So blessings have two fundamental parts, some blessings three. Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, Lord. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, King of the universe. Notice that those two phrases have two different or complementary views of God. Baruch atah Adonai, atah means you. So God in this prayer is represented as, in Martin Buber's terms, a thou. an entity with which or with whom we can have a relationship. Ata, very near. God's immanence, God's nearness. Eloheinu melech haolam. God, Master Melech, King of the universe. This is God in God's cosmic aspect, or God as transcendent. So those first 6 words, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, already promote a complex theology. God is both near and far. God is a listening ear. God can be turned to at any moment for a sense of intimacy. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you, Atah, you are with me. And that's one of the main ideas of the 23rd Psalm. In times of difficulty, God is near, is intimate to us. As we, in the idea of imitating God, need to be near to one another at times of difficulty and times of great joy. So the first 6 words, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, announce that God is present, both as transcendent and immanent. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, who has sanctified us with God's commandments. So the commandments are something that gives sanctity, holiness, meaning to our lives. Through deploying the commandments, we lift up our lives into an arena of holiness. Okay? So all of those introductory words are general. Then we come to the specific blessing or mitzvah that we are performing. La'asot b'divrei Torah. So, praised are you, O Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us la'asot b'divrei Torah, to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Notice the idea of immersion in the words of Torah, and not to draw doctrinal positions, not to see the unity of biblical religion, but to announce an activity. We are immersing ourselves together in these words in order to understand, in order to think about how it might relate to our lives, in order to create, I might call it a kind of dialectic, a conversation of, I affirm this, but I'm not sure, let me read on as I adjust what I am reading. So that what the blessing for the study of Torah for us is an opportunity to gather together to take seriously the words of the fundamental text of our tradition in order together to try to create some illumination, some insight, some power in these words, which is always an ongoing process. And some of us have been doing this now for, here at the Temple, 30 plus years. And I think it's fair for me to say, tell me if you disagree, we're not done yet. We haven't finally gotten to the bottom of it, which I think is a sign of a great text. What makes a classic is that it gets to some of the fundamental elements of the human condition without trying to reduce them to one particular point of view. Is Achilles a hero or a villain? It does Odysseus on his way back to Ithaca, who stops for 8 years with, who was it, Calypso. Why does he continue on? Is he intent on getting home? Or is the wandering itself the purpose of the wandering, and so on. And the Torah, aside from being a religious classic, is also a general classic because it deals with the fundamental dilemmas of the human condition, where we're confronted with options and we have to feel our way through what they are. Okay, so let's engage in the blessing for the study of Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so we are now working on the prophet Amos. And every time I go back to Amos, I'm really struck by how extremely rich this book is. As I've said before, and I won't go through it again, Amos has been maybe the fundamental biblical book for the Reform movement, especially in its earlier classical stage. The Reform movement, among other things, has always been very concerned with issues of social justice. And the sense that Amos gives illustration to, that the true worship of God can't be limited to the ritual. It has to embrace how we treat one another. And if we treat one another with indifference or with hostility, no matter how often we come to services, no matter how pure our ritual intention, is not pleasing to God because of the way in which we treat one another. So that the prophets, oftentimes the prophets, and especially Amos, have been viewed as being anti-ritual. I think that that's not true. I think that the prophet's critique of ritual is that it can lead us to self-satisfaction. What did you do last night? I came to services. What did you do at services? I sang loudly and with feeling. During the silent prayer, I was very, very reflective. These are all important components of a rich ritual experience. Amos would have said, I also want to know how you're treating the vulnerable. If you're indifferent to them or their needs, then I don't care how pure your experience at the ritual is. So the ritual has status for these prophets, but it's not ultimate. What is ultimate is the kind of society that we're able to create and to live in. So what I would like to do now, and especially thinking about those who are here for the first time, is to do a quick review of Amos. So let's turn to the very beginning. And take a quick peruse up to where we left off. And where we left off the last time was at the end of chapter 5. Okay? Page 1015. So, what we have at the beginning in the first verse is what scholars call a superscription, a comment positioning Amos in his time and place. The words of Amos, a ship breeder from Tekoa. Tekoa is in the south. Let me say something about this. As you may know, the kingdom was unified under Saul, King Saul, the first king, who was followed by David, who made Jerusalem his capital and brought greater unity to the realm. David's son Solomon then reigned. David and Solomon each reigned for 40 years. Let's put the beginning of David's reign conveniently at 1000 before the Common Era. So by 8 920, 80 years later, David and Solomon each had reigned for 40 years, okay? Solomon's son, because this was a dynastic form of governance, Rehoboam did not allow Jeroboam and his group to participate in the enterprise. And for this, Jeroboam and his group seceded from the unified kingdom, went north, created the kingdom of Israel. Israel now is not just the entire land, but the northern kingdom. And in 820 or so, the unified kingdom is divided into north and south, Israel and Judah, okay? Israel north, Judah, one of two tribes that remain in the south, Judah being the prominent tribe, the other being Benjamin, which was eventually absorbed by Judah. So now we have 2 tribes in the south and 10 tribes in the north. Okay? The north is defeated by the Assyrian Empire in 722, and the Assyrian custom of dealing with defeated peoples is to scatter them. That is to undermine any chance of their maintaining their integrity as a group and therefore their power and the possibility of rebelling against the realm. Okay? Thus the 10 lost tribes. The prophet Ezekiel, many years later, makes the claim that at the end of days, God will recover the remnants of the 10 lost tribes and bring them back to be reunified with Judah and Benjamin. So Ezekiel's vision is what we might call eschatological, at the end of days. Now, all of those people have disappeared in the hundreds of years since, but God in God's omniscience knows where they are and can bring them back, okay? But short of that miraculous event, we don't know where the 10 lost tribes are. That's 722. The southern kingdom persists until 586, when the empire that defeated the Assyrians, the Babylonians, take the remaining 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, into exile, into Babylonia, hence the Babylonian exile. And the Babylonians had a different view of how to deal with defeated peoples, take them out of their land, but allow them national identity. So they are gathered together and continue their national existence in exile. Had the Babylonians treated the southern tribes the way the Assyrians treated the northern tribes, Judaism would have been over, because everybody would have been scattered and no national entity or possibility would remain. So I like to say, somewhat outrageously, is that the Babylonians saved Judaism, because 70 years later they were able to begin to return and to rebuild the Second Temple, which was dedicated in 515. As we know, the Persian Empire in 540 defeated the Babylonian Empire and had yet a third way of dealing with defeated peoples. The Persians allowed the exiles to return to Israel and to continue their national life on the condition that they be faithful to the empire. In other words, the Persians didn't just exhibit largesse, they also did this for their own purposes, because Egypt is always looming as a competitor, and if you put the loyal Israelites into the land of Israel, they can serve as a buffer against incursions by Egypt, okay? And so the Persians allowed groups, exiled groups, to return on the condition that they remained faithful. And the Persians as well not only sustained the continuity of Judaism, which at this point is a kind of proto-Judaism, but they also sustained and strengthened their own empire. Okay, so back to Amos. The words of Amos, a sheep breeder from Tekoa. Tekoa's in the south, in Judah, not in the north, not in Israel, who prophesies concerning Israel, that is the north, in the reigns of King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam the son of Joash of Israel, 2 kings, 2 realms, north and south, 2 years before the earthquake. That is an extremely packed couple of sentences. The words of Amos, a sheep breeder. So Amos is a person from the countryside. He's not a person from the city. And so his language is likely to use metaphors of pastoral metaphors. Who prophesies, now we have to learn what prophecy is, concerning Israel in the reigns of King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam. And we know when they reigned, in the middle of the 8th century. Let's put it at 750. So, Amos is prophesying 30 years before the destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians, 722, 721. So Amos is living during a very tumultuous time. And we could ask ourselves, what gives rise to Amos's dire prophecies? Because Amos is to some significant degree a prophet of doom, not a prophet of happiness, not a prophet of good times, although we're going to see some of that. There are 2 possible understandings of how Amos came to this view of things, and they're not mutually exclusive. One is simply God told him what's about to happen, okay? So this is one of the things that makes a prophet, who speaks for a higher authority, in this case, God. And therefore, any historical, sociological conditions that may have given rise to what happened 30 years later become potentially irrelevant. When God says, go speak these words, that's a sufficient condition for going out and doing it. Because as Amos will point out, when God speaks to the prophet has no choice. The prophet must proclaim God's words. The second possible source of Amos's prophecy are precisely the social, political conditions of the community to which Amos is preaching. And I think Amos would agree with the following claim, that a society becomes weaker and therefore more vulnerable if it's characterized by injustice, by a strictly hierarchical understanding of social structure. The haves and the have-nots. And the haves begin to dwell on their own riches and own possibilities, and may tend to ignore the problems of the vulnerable that live very, very different lives. And Amos, I might say, is sensitive to the way in which social injustice is not only a problem in itself, it weakens societies. And it weakens the resolve of societies to look to their reconstitution, to look to their protection. And therefore, there's no mystery in why Amos, only 30 years before the final destruction, saw the clouds of disillusion on the horizon. So one could say that Amos is both a very astute reader of the times, by which I might mean an ancient New York Times. That just occurred to me. He's a reader of the situation. But also, Amos feels that this is not just a sociological or historical event. This is really a cosmic event, because the Torah, especially in Deuteronomy, will make the claim that you reap what you sow. If you follow the commandments, things will go well with you. If you disobey the commandments, things will go badly for you. Following the commandments is not only an imperative, it is also good for us, because honor your father and mother, that you shall dwell long in the land that the Lord your God has given you, the fifth commandment. What does this mean? It can mean one of two things. Honor your father and mother, and God will perform a miracle for you, and you'll live long on the land. There is some mechanical relationship between obedience and what happens next. Although we could understand this commandment in a different way. Honoring one's parents, that is honoring the processes, the values that can be learned in the family, are a condition for a healthy society. Because as Maimonides says, the family is the first part of the city. We learn how to be good citizens, good neighbors in our families. And if we don't honor our parents, if we don't honor the family structure, parents as teachers, as models, then society is inevitably, this is not just a matter of divine intervention, will roll downhill to disillusion and destruction. So, Amos here in verse 1, you can see how packed it is positioned as a person from the pasture who prophesied in the north at a particular time, 750 we might say, before the Common Era, 2 years before the earthquake. And as I've pointed out, scholars believe there was an earthquake in 751, which means Amos is prophesying in 753 before the Common Era. In chapter 7, we learn that he goes to the altar at Bethel and gives a sermon and is kicked out of the city by Amaziah, the priest, and we'll get there. So that it's possible that the book of Amos has as its origin one sermon given at one time in one place that was thought to be so consequential that somebody or buddies wrote it down. How do we know this? Well, look at the verse 1. Amos didn't write that. This is an editor contextualizing Amos. And therefore we already know that whatever Amos spoke was taken to be so seriously that people began to write it down. And we just don't know how, over what period of time, the book of Amos was subject to editorial expansion. One clue is that in chapter 9, the last chapter, Amos seems to know that there was a destruction of the northern kingdom, which happened 30 years after he preached, which might suggest, I'm not saying must, that by that time, people were already taking it seriously, recognizing that the event that Amos prophesied in chapter 9 had already come to pass. And one of the ways in which a prophet's word is kept is if the prophecy comes true. Isaiah famously prophesied the destruction of the south, which didn't come true, which I'm sure undermined to some degree the prestige of the prophet, who had plenty of other ways in which it could be. So, the book of Amos probably went through a period of oral transmission by disciples, by those who wanted to keep alive these words, and they came to recognize that it's only through writing that oral words are going to be sustained. Oral traditions are vulnerable to decay. I suppose there are great exceptions to that. The Homeric epics are exceptions to that. We think that Homer, if there was a Homer, delivered the epics in about 1200 before the Common Era. They were finally written down only in 750 to 725. So there must have been a long period of oral transmission. And scholars, by the way, have looked at contemporary oral societies to see what are the methods of keeping a record of what has been said through oral methods. There's a famous father and son who went to Yugoslavia to listen to bards who were delivering oral myths and so on. And these two, father and son, recognized that a part of the resources of an oral deliverer are certain pat phrases, and that these phrases can be called upon by the one who has memorized a certain portion of an epic when the speaker feels that he's come to a kind of stop and needs something to help him get over to the other side. So there are ways of sustaining oral transmission, but writing it down is a better way of doing it. As a matter of fact, in the history of Judaism, writing down the words of the rabbis was always verboten because of the possibility of misunderstanding. If you write it down, it's available to others more readily than if it's just delivered orally. But Yehuda HaNasi, who finally writes down the Mishnah, makes the claim that in times of danger for a people, the times of the rise of the Roman Empire and early Christianity, peoples are in danger and they might lose their oral tradition. So against all strictures to the contrary, writing it down now becomes not only possible but necessary in order to maintain continuity. So, what we have here in chapter 1 is something extremely rich with the possibility or the reality that what Amos is about to proclaim was taken so seriously and as something so profound as finally to be subject to writing down and editorial expansion. So, verse 2, he proclaims, here's what he says. The Lord roars from Zion, shouts aloud from Jerusalem. Already a bit of a puzzle, because Amos goes north to speak against the northern kingdom. But he's also bringing Jerusalem in as another object of rebuke. So, whether or not Jerusalem is added here by a subsequent editor who wants to broaden the purview of Amos's words, or whether Amos himself is speaking both to north and south, is a problem for interpreters. The Lord roars from Zion. God is represented here as not just gently saying what God wants to say. God is roaring. God is angry, with the image of a lion. Shouts aloud from Jerusalem, and the pastures of the shepherd shall languish, and the summit of Carmel shall wither. This is the impact of the divine words on even the natural world, how dramatic and how powerful the divine words are. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4 I will not revoke it. And now we have a repetition of this same formula. For 3 transgressions of Damascus, that is, a non-Israelite community, for 4. Verse 6, thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not revoke it. God is going to punish not only the Syrians, Damascus, but also the Gazans. That is one of the Philistine cities. Verse 9. Well, let's go back. Verse 6. For 3 transgressions of Gaza, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they exiled an entire population, which they delivered to Edom. I will send down fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it shall devour its fortresses, and I will wipe out the inhabitants of Ashdod and the sceptered ruler of Ashkelon, 2 more Philistine cities. And I will turn my hand against Ekron, another city, and the Philistines shall perish to the last man, said the Lord. With what is God concerned? We might say, with what goes on among the people God called and redeemed from Egypt. And so God is going to rebuke Israel and or Judah. But no, God is rebuking a non-Israelite people for their depravities against other non-Israelite people. Let's go on, verse 9. For 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4 I will not revoke it, because they handed over an entire population to Edom. Verse 11. Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, for 4, and so on. Well, let's go on there. Because he pursued his brother with the sword, and repressed all pity, because his anger raged unceasing and his fury stormed unchecked. Verse 13, thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of the Ammonites, and for 4 I will not revoke it. I will set fire, verse 14, to the wall of Rabbah. Chapter 2, for thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Moab, and for 4 I will not revoke it, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom. So, a non-Israelite people, the Moabites, assaulting a non-Israelite people, the Edomites, which has nothing to do with the history of the people of Israel or Judah. And this has consequences, implications, doesn't it? For whom is God God? And the answer is everyone. God is a universal God. One could think, if one follows the story of Exodus, that God follows the career of the Israelites. And in this sense, God is a local deity. God is a mountain deity whom Moses had some interaction with on Mount Sinai. But the prophets are now stating, more or less unequivocally, I mean, Amos hasn't said it directly, but by these series of transgressions, another people, and especially against yet another people having nothing to do with Israel, means that God superintends the histories and the goings-on of all peoples by extension. So Amos now becomes or represents monotheism. Monotheism is different from monolatry. Monolatry, mono, one, is one God for each people. One God for each people is an anticipation of monotheism, but it's not yet monotheism because it presumes many gods. Polytheism is many gods for many peoples. Each people has many gods. Monolatry is each people has a god. Monotheism is each people has the same God, one God. So what we have here is not monolatry, because it's God who is saying this, the one God for Amos. about the goings-on, the doings of all peoples by extension, whether or not they are doing it with or to Israel. What the Moabites do to the Edomites has nothing to do with the Israelites, and yet God, the God of Israel, is watching over them and cares. Verse 4 of chapter 2. Now Amos moves to narrow the focus. Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah. Now he has come home, so to speak. But Judah seems to be a bit of a problem because Amos has gone north to speak against Israel. Judah here may be one of 2 things. Amos is concerned with both north and south, or a subsequent editor wanted to broaden the scope of Amos's rebuke to all of Israel and changes Samaria to Judah. It's possible that there's editorial work at play here. For 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4 I will not revoke it, because they spurned the teaching of the Lord. And the word in Hebrew is Torah, Torat Adonai. But Torah, as we know, is generic, teaching. It's not yet the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Okay? So for spurning the teaching of the Lord. But what does Amos know? Amos knows the tradition of some teaching having been given by God to the people. So Amos already, we can see, knows something of the history of his people and have not observed his laws. They are beguiled by delusions after which their fathers walked. I will send down fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the fortresses of Jerusalem. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel. So you can see the development here. Against the nations, against the south, Judah, finally against the people to whom Amos is prophesying in the north. I will not revoke it because they have sold for silver those whose cause was just. Here Amos gets to one of his main points. He's concerned about social justice. And this is the heart of Amos's religion. And the needy for a pair of sandals. Ah, you who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground, and make the humble walk a twisted course. Father and son go to the same girl, and therefore profane my holy name. How we treat one another, the abuses we may be engaged in, are not only, we might call it horizontal, social, interpersonal, they are vertical. They actually profane God's name. When we treat our neighbors badly, when we violate the standards of a marriage, this is not only between one person and another or his or her neighborhood, it also affects God. This is an abuse. Social infractions are religious infractions. They recline by every altar on garments taken in pledge. Don't you see the sarcasm here? They go to the altar. They go to the worship service. What time are services this morning? Well, 10:30. Or let's go sit at the altar. But they sit there on garments taken in pledge, which is a violation of not keeping the pledge of a poor person overnight. If you give a loan to a person who needs it and take back collateral, namely the person's cloak, you must give it back to this person before nightfall. Otherwise, in what shall he sleep? The author in Deuteronomy says. This is a violation. This is an inhumane act. So they recline at every altar. How wonderful we are. On garments taken in pledge, and drink in the house of their God, wine brought with fines they imposed, and so on. Let's skip down here to verse 10. And I brought you up from the land of Egypt and led you through the wilderness. Now, let's go back to 9. Yet I destroyed the Amorite before them. God has already rebuked and punished other peoples for violating the moral law, whose stature was like the cedars. That nation that seemed as strong, unassailable as the cedars, God destroyed. There's no safety when you violate the norms of society or the divine norms. And who was stout as an oak, destroying his boughs above and his trunk below. And I brought you up from the land of Egypt. Note the implication. I was involved in the lives of the Amorites. They might have thought I was going to protect them no matter what. And yet I had to destroy them because of these ethical violations. What about you? I brought you up from the land of Egypt, led you through the wilderness 40 years to possess the land of the Amorite. Look at how great we are. God brought us up out of the land of Egypt, led us through the wilderness, and gave us the land that beforehand had belonged to the Amorite, whom God destroyed, not only for their own infractions, but we might infer to open up that land for us. We are really special here. And I raised up prophets, verse 11, from among your sons. Oh, that's a warning sign. Why do you need prophets? You need prophets if the society is becoming corrupt. And Nazarites from among your young men. The Nazarites, we might say, are models of a certain kind of exemplary life. So the Nazarite becomes a symbol of the way we could live our lives. And God raised up prophets to warn us, and Nazarites as models. God wanted us, according to Amos, to live good lives. So God is sending warnings and sending models. Is that not so, O people of Israel, says the Lord? But you made the Nazarites drink wine and ordered the prophets not to prophesy. You treated with contempt the things I sent you in order to give you a way to live an exemplary life. I will slow your movements as a wagon is slowed when it is full of cut grain. Flight shall fail to the swift. What does that mean? Flight shall fail. Are we going to need to flee? Yes. This is an indirect way of saying, I'm sending enemies. And you will flee. But you will be like a wagon stuck in the mud. You won't be able to escape. The strong shall find no strength. The warrior shall not save his life. The bowman shall not hold his ground, and the fleet-footed shall not escape. Nor the horseman save his life. Even the most stout-hearted warrior shall run away unarmed that day, declares the Lord. So what's the sum of chapters 1 and 2? God is concerned with injustice. God is concerned with the injustice of any society. And so he gives illustration, examples, 4, 5, 6, 7 examples, then turns to Judah, then turns to Israel as more examples of the same kind of thing. So at this point, Amos is integrating the history of Israel and Judah and the meaning of those communities into world history. Just another 2 examples of social and ethical wrong. You are not special. You're just like all the others. Okay? So the universalism of Amos's God follows the logic of universalism, that there are no distinctions among elements of the same category. If there were, it wouldn't be a universalism. It might be a kind of universalism with a few exceptions. But at the end of chapter 2, there's nothing special about Israel and Judah, north and south, subject to the same Torat Adonai, the teaching of God. And that has to be assumed because you don't punish someone who doesn't have knowledge of right and wrong and the freedom to do the right thing. And that's the human condition. Everybody has free will. Everybody knows what is right and what is wrong. And therefore, punishment for infraction is just. To the Edomite, to the Moabite, to the Amorite, to Israel, to Judah, alike. It's pretty stunning, I think, isn't it? I mean, Amos has really mounted. This isn't just really interesting poetry with dramatic imagery. This is a worldview about the relationship between people's teachings of God and God. The universal God who helped us to know the right way and was going to punish us without distinction who the us is. Now we've got chapter 3. Hear this word, O people of Israel, that the Lord has spoken concerning you, concerning the whole family that I brought up from the land of Egypt. So far, continuation. I brought this people up from here, I brought this people, and I brought you up from Egypt. You alone have I singled out of all the families of the earth. That is why I will call you to account for all your iniquities. So Amos goes in exactly the opposite direction now. That in the universe of the universal God, there is a distinctive people. You alone have I singled out. In the Hebrew, Rach etchem Yadati, whom I have known intimately of all the families of the earth. So, now we've got the universal God and a special people. We might call this people a chosen people, distinctive. What's the nature of the chosenness? Stuart? So not chosen for special glory, but chosen for special responsibility. You now have a burden that, by implication, Amos doesn't say this, other peoples don't have. Your distinctiveness is responsibility. Responsibility comes from the word response. So your fundamental orientation in life is to be responsive. And to be responsive is to acknowledge the prior need or act of another. I can't be responsive to something that hasn't happened. If I'm responsive, something else is prior to my capacity for responsiveness. And that is for Amos, other people and moral strictures. That's what responsibility is, to make room primarily for the other to which I respond. Jim?
Well, I think the order of the proclamations of the various people's groups, I think is quite relevant because he's saying to them, here's what happens to every group, and you're no different. So he's subtly throwing in humbleness. But what he's saying is, now these people didn't have
like that. I like that. So Jim's point here is not only the idea of humility, but of special responsibility because of the gifts you have been given. Torah as a gift of insight, enlightenment. We might say that Amos here is calling the history of ancient Judaism a kind of enlightenment where special, particularized knowledge is given. Now, I think we also have to acknowledge that it would be unjust for God to punish peoples who had no knowledge. So there's an assumption here that the Moabites and the Ammonites and so on knew right from wrong, otherwise it would be unjust to punish them. Since, let's assume Jim's idea here, that they did not get a special in language revelation, what is it that they might have had? I think the answer might be conscience. After all, go back to Cain and Abel. Cain is punished for killing Abel. How did he know that was wrong? He must have known it was wrong because the Torah doesn't say he was ever given a thou shalt not murder. And therefore we might say that the Torah also has a view of natural conscience, an endowment for everybody. And natural conscience might be another way of talking about natural law, which is a very, very interesting idea here, because one could say that fundamentally the Torah's basic doctrine is there is no natural law, there is only revealed law, what we might call posited or positive law. But here, I think, just to carry forward Jim's insight, is that people without a particular revelation still being held responsible must have something. Conscience, a feature of natural law. Such an interesting idea, I think. Jim?
But it's also the complacency where each of these societies have become affluent relative to that time. People become complacent.
Yeah.
And they forgot how they got there.
Yeah, there you go.
The lesson.
Yeah. Absolutely. So what Jim is suggesting here is, I might say, a general pattern that as elements of society become wealthier, less vulnerable themselves, it's possible, I don't want to say necessary, for people to become complacent and to be concerned with their own wealth and endowment, and begin not to think about the otherness of the other. That's the problem with the other as a concept, isn't it? That they're other from us and therefore unlike us, and therefore we're not responsible for them because they're not like us. And that's one of the ideas, I think, that Amos is promoting here, a sort of a generalized view of human nature, the equality of all human beings, without saying it like this. Am I wrong about this? I mean, it's so easy to take values that we embrace and to throw them back into the ancient world as if they already existed there. Okay. Anyway, what do you think of? What do you think about what's going on here in Amos? Any thoughts about it, Ellen?
I think that to bring it into this time that we're living in, we become the other.
In what sense?
Persecution, fear of retribution,
Okay.
name calling.
Okay, so Ellen has made an interesting point that especially in recent years with the rise of anti-Semitism, that the Jews have once again become othered. And I think that makes an interesting point, that there is not just one category of otherness. It depends on who is doing the othering. We could talk about different elements of society: African Americans, immigrants, Muslims, Jews, depending upon, I guess, the dynamics of society and people that succumb to certain problems in society or in themselves. I don't know how to say that. Yeah, very good, very good. Amos is very much against the category of other, that fundamentally we're all the same and therefore have to care about one another, not just as a social good, but also as a spiritual, as a religious good as well. The horizontal has an implication for the vertical, if you're following my language here. Okay, so chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 are a great and surprising climax. You know, as I'm saying this, I'm just wondering, let's imagine that Amos gave the sermon that we are reading right now. This is a transcription of Amos's sermon. I want to suggest that that is improbable. I mean, this is such a highly structured piece of writing, that you would think that either Amos was a logician who the night before he gave the sermon sat down with a yellow pad and pen and started taking notes and said, how am I going to put this together? You know, I think I'm going to start with rebuke. Who am I going to rebuke? Well, the Moabites. I really hate the Moabites. I'm going to write down the Moabites. Then I'm going right to Israel. I think I better build to it. So I'm going to talk about the Edomites. How many examples do I need? There's not a determinable number, but let me do 6 or 7. Then I'm going to make a shift to Judah. And now people are beginning to prick their ears. But they're northerners, so let Judah. I know they're our ancestors, but now I'm gonna pull a fast one. I'm gonna do Israel, and I'm going to absorb Israel and Judah into mankind, humankind, without differentiation. And now I'm gonna sock it to them. I'm gonna start chapter 3. Because Amos realized that he's at the end of chapter 2, tongue-in-cheek here. And I'm going to say to them, you are different. Oh, thank you very much. So good to hear, Amos, that we're just not absorbed into all humanity because of the burden of responsibility. I mean, this is a rhetorical masterpiece, isn't it? And could it have been? The answer, of course, is yes. But what is the probability of some guy sitting down the night before, Saturday night, because he's going to give this, Friday night, and writing it so clearly with so many crescendos, high points along the way? It looks to me like there's some editorial expansion or work on this material. Doesn't diminish it, but I think it, in a way, it points out that the development of biblical literature, the Bible didn't emerge whole cloth all at once, I think one might want to say. So now, Gary. This is learned at Sinai. Yeah. So Gary's question is, or statement is that what Amos is saying to the people here is not something brand new, because they already had the traditions or even the literature of Sinai, which is an interesting point. I mean, if one wanted to talk about the development of biblical literature, after all, Deuteronomy, scholars believe, or at least Proto-Deuteronomy, the kernel of it, was discovered in the temple in 622. This is 130 years after Amos. So it's possible that Amos doesn't know the literature of the Bible, but what does Amos know? He knows that the people were brought up out of Egypt and so on. So Amos does know something of the traditions of the people, and therefore we might infer without knowing that the people already know those traditions. Otherwise, referring to them would have no impact on them. If he referred to those traditions, people would say, what? I know nothing about it. So I think a plausible assumption is they do know it. So why is Amos, I think your question, Gary, points to something about the intensity of Amos's sermon. It's one thing to tell people something they didn't know, and you need this for being sustained, so it's important to you. It's another order of intensity to tell something people do know, but are not heeding. It's one thing, you're not paying attention to some law. What law? Honor your father and mother. I didn't know that before. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to be thinking about that. But if they knew it, and Amos is rebuking them for not deploying what they know, so I think you've got a nice insight here. It's not only that Amos knows something, he's assuming, we could infer, that the people know as well. Amos knows his audience. I often say to bar and bat mitzvah kids when I'm reviewing their Devar Torahs, their speeches, it's one thing to write something that is cogent and interesting, but especially when you're going to deliver this to an audience, you have to also think about what the audience needs. And you can't, I was dealing with one kid just this past week who wrote a really sophisticated Devar Torah on her Torah portion. But as she read it to me, I thought to myself, this is moving so fast. The sentences are complicated. She's going to lose her audience. And wouldn't it be a shame if the work that this person, this 13-year-old, put into this didn't make an impact on the congregation? Because like most people who aren't used to speaking to groups, not paying attention to what the audience needs or already has. What can you work with that the audience has to make an impact on the audience? What's the goal of public speaking? Not just to display logical rigor, but to make an impact. And I think Gary is suggesting that aside from having very rich substance, Amos, or Amos's editors, are rhetoricians. We know Aristotle's definition of rhetoric. Rhetoric is an art. It's an art to discover in any given situation the available means of persuasion. It's not that there are rules of persuading. You have to ask yourself, what's the situation? Who's my audience? What does the audience need? And if I see what my audience is, then I can try to discern the available means of persuasion. What metaphors do I use? What allusions do I use that may touch the audience? I was just thinking this morning about the issue of metaphor. And if I'm talking to somebody about baseball, which every now and then I do, and I wanted to use a metaphor, I might use the metaphor of keep the inning alive. Now, innings don't have life. It's a metaphor. But somebody who knows and likes the language of baseball, that metaphor is going to have an impact. Whereas on people that don't care at all about baseball, and I'm sorry to say such people exist, that metaphor is going to fall flat. So that the choice of a metaphor will have something to do with how much we discern who my audience is. And I'm making a big deal out of this because I think Gary is onto something. Amos knows his audience, what they know, what they might be sensitive to, and what might surprise them. Coming late to Israel and Judah in this litany of rebuke is going to lull the audience. Yeah, those Moabites, God, give it to them. Yes, give it to them. And the Edomites, oh yeah, aren't they terrible? We're so great. It's you. But he doesn't start with that, because what kind of a rhetorical move would that? That would be wasting the value of suspense. So I think it's not only are the ideas very rich, but the delivery is rich as well. Let's move on. Yes, please.
Do you think Amos is a prophet of his own time, or is a prophet of some other time? Because, Israel gets disbanded a few years later, and, obviously, according to Amos, they didn't heed his message.
Yeah.
You could say that's why they were dispersed.
Yeah.
That's why they weren't successful.
So your question, tell me your name, please.
Lou.
Lou, okay. I always say to people I'm meeting for the first time, it takes me 4 times of repetition to get it. Okay. So Lou is asking the question, let me rephrase it and see if you agree with this rephrasing. Is Amos's message for his time only, or for more times? Or we might say for all times. Would that be a fair? So this gets us into the issue of canonization. What gets into the canon? By the way, the word canon comes from the Greek word that means a measure, a measuring stick. How long is a yard? Well, a yard isn't measured by something else. A yard is the measure. So that a canon is the standard by which other things are measured. What becomes canonical is what is seen as a measure for the kinds of things that Amos is talking about. What is he talking about? Ethical corruption, the nature of a people. So I might say that Amos makes it into the canon because those who created the canon recognized the universality of Amos's message. And therefore, written for a particular time, it's relevant for all time. What do you think?
His message is in the Torah. It's not a new message. It says, allow for the poor, don't eat from the corners of your field, don't think, whatever drops to the ground, so provide for people who are less fortunate than we are. That's a message of the Torah that's pretty distinctive. Leviticus and Numbers.
So Lou, to my response that Amos is, to Lou's question, is it just for his time or for more times? My response is for all times because it's included in the canon. To that, Lou's next question is, yes, but isn't Amos in a way redundant? we have a lot of this stuff already in the 5 books of Moses. So why do we need, of the limited amount of space, we don't want to include everything in the canon. We have to make choices. How come Amos is one of the choices since we already have his stuff elsewhere? I think that's a great question. Sue?
Could it be that the message is that we need reminding?
Okay, so Sue's response is, it is elsewhere, but the things we might be tending to forget require reminders. So the editors of the Torah, of the Tanakh, in their wisdom, recognize, I might call it the psychological half-life of an idea. How long does an idea, especially a challenging one, remain in our awareness? And the half-life is not very long. And therefore, the more repetition, the more we recognize the fragileness of the original idea, which needs to be reiterated over and over again. What about that? So when we get repetition, we can draw something about the putting together of the Torah. These are the things that the editors felt were fragile or easily forgotten. Yeah. Hi, Chad.
How are you? You can disagree with me on this, but something.
I can't wait.
Jeremiah is considered the greatest, one of the greatest prophets. He got a lot of things wrong, but he got one thing right, and he's in the canon. He said that you should submit to Nebuchadnezzar, otherwise Jerusalem will be destroyed.
Oh, there you go. Chad's a former neighbor of mine, and I always hate it when you make good points.
I've listened to you for.
So Chad is making a very, very interesting point. To me, a bit exaggerated, but nevertheless. Jeremiah got some stuff wrong. And it's true that Jeremiah said, don't fight against Nebuchadnezzar, succumb. He also makes this point later on that when you get to Babylonia, pray for the welfare of the government, settle in, raise your crops, and so on. Jeremiah doesn't go into Babylonia. He goes down to Egypt where he disappears. So Chad's suggestion, therefore, is since he got some really important stuff wrong, how does he get into the canon? And the answer is, doesn't matter, he got there. He got there. Somebody slipped in when the other sages weren't looking. Somebody said, put him in now. Once you get in the canon, you're there forever. Could have been a trade. I'll give you Nehemiah if you give me Jeremiah. I mean, it's possible that it was like that. When you think about the New Testament, we know that there are many non-canonical gospels that did not make it into the canon. How come we have just those 4? And we could go in 2 very different directions. They got in because they are unique and they deserve to be in because of their content. Or we could say they've got lucky. They just happen to have promoters. Well, how come Paul, the letters of Paul, are half the New Testament? Paul had some good sponsors, and he really got most of the, so that, I mean, one could say this is sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I'm sure it's also right that if we assume that the things in the canons are what belong there because of their content, and the things that aren't in the canon don't belong there because of their content. And we know that that's a very foolish position. I mean, just think about the idea of the canons of English 101 at the university. This is now a very controversial question. When I was in college and took a course in political philosophy, the professor, and this is way back in the 60s, the professor wanted to bring into the class a tract by a Chinese philosopher. He was challenging the adequacy of the canon of Western political philosophy to a set number of Middle European males who wrote very important things, but is this all that belongs? So there is something accidental about it. I think that's true. I think, but the other side of it is, Jeremiah wrote some very quite astonishing things. Among them is autobiographical information, where Jeremiah, you remember Moses was called by God and tries to get out of it. Call somebody else, right? The people will say, who am I? People say, who are you? By the way, I have a speech impediment. So Moses already is the paradigm of the reluctant prophet. And Jeremiah is the reluctant prophet par excellence. You know, why did you call me? I don't want to be. And God says to Jeremiah, look, I chose you when you were in the womb. You were already my prophet before you came into the, so don't tell me you don't want to do it. So, yeah, right. And Jeremiah does get something wrong. So interesting. The editors, now I'm just speculating, would have liked to have taken that part out, except diaspora, but by that time it was already a sacred text, as a guess. Yes, Michael.
I noticed that he apparently knew that Judah, the two tribes to the south, were aware of the teaching of the Lord, and then, then also, of course, that Israel did. So there's really sort of a hierarchy there. First the non-Israelite, and then Judah, and then Israel, but then the rest of the chapter, it's all Israel. There's not any further mention. So it's almost like he's sort of demoting the importance of Judah in terms of a source for his reminders that we obviously always need. So is there any significance to that, sort of a non-equality of the two of Judah and Israel here?
What are you saying, that he turns to Judah or he turns to Israel?
First he deals with the non-Israelite.
Right.
Then he goes to Judah, then he goes to Israel.
Uh-huh.
We convinced that Judah had affirmed the teaching of the Lord, so therefore he knows that they do those teachings. When referring to Israel, at the end of that, he says, they are God.
Uh-huh.
Almost as if the God of Israel only and not
Ah.
the God of Judah.
Oh, I see what you mean.
He does not quite say that. And then for the rest of all the chapters, it's only a reference to Israel and no further references to Judah or to any significance.
Right. And so what are you saying here? Is Amos finally saying that it's Israel and Israel alone that is unique? Yeah. Okay, so I kind of like that. I mean, I think that what we ought to do is go through the whole thing and see to what degree that is true. Let's assume it is. I mean, so I have 3 children, and I deal with all of them, I hope, with the same kind of love and affection and so on. When I'm playing tennis with my son, that's my focus, because I'm playing tennis. That doesn't mean, if you asked me, is my son now the first among equals? The answer would be no, of course not. I'm playing tennis with him and not with the girls. But they're all precious to me in the same way. So it could be that he's now focused on Israel for the sake of some consistency, where he's left the issue of other nations, which only means that he has now decided to focus on Israel. That's where he's going, but it's not a value judgment. I'm not sure if that's a good response, but I mean, in the sense that it's true. It may not be true. I think it makes some sense. Yeah. By the way, I'm going to read to you chapter 9, verse 7, way at the very end. To me, 9:7. To me, O Israelites, you are just like the Ethiopians, declares the Lord. True, I brought Israel up from the land of Egypt, but also the Philistines from Kaftor and the Arameans from Kir, and so on. So here, in a very dramatic form, how should I finish that sentence? Amos, it's as if, I'm going to pick on Michael a little bit here. It's as if Amos anticipated what Michael was going to say. And what Michael was going to say was, finally, it's Israel. And this is the center of all values for me. And I've left behind deep concern, if any concern, for the other nations. Having heard what Michael said, Amos, who's still working in his study, decides he's going to try to qualify what Michael has said. And so here comes what we might call, it's a technical term, an Amos zinger. To me, O Israelites, you are just like the Ethiopians, declares the Lord. True, I brought you guys up from Egypt, but I also brought up the Philistines from Kaftor. I also brought up the Arameans from Kir. That crucial, decisive moment in the history of biblical religion, the Exodus from Egypt, which made us distinct. You among all the peoples are the people that I care about. Now, hey, God did it several times. God, a lot of exoduses going on here. Not just it happens that peoples are leaving some sort of tyranny and getting their freedom. Amos is saying the very God who says all these things about Israel is the very God who treated a lot of people this way. So don't make yourself so bold as to think you're the only ones.
So it's almost as if God is saying, I am the God of defeated peoples. I am the God of people who are in the diaspora. So, for instance, I know you also like music. If one were to hear a particular song who's one that played tennis later today, his rendition of I Wish I Knew What It Was Like to Be Free, if those people singing that chorus could be Kurds, they could be Armenians, they could be Jews, they could be Palestinians, they could be Native Americans, they could be anyone who's Irish, been defeated and dispersed, and he's the God of all.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a return, a dramatic return to the ideology of chapters 1 and 2. Look, I mean, I think that Amos has spent a lot of time on Israel. And he means this. This is very serious. He's taking it very seriously. But then he's saying to himself, as you're sitting there listening to this sermon, it's not fun to be rebuked. I know you guys are feeling bad about all this rebuke, but you're getting a lot of attention. God is really attending to you. And God is the God also of liberation. One of the sub-themes in Amos is there will be liberation. Amos is not just a prophet of doom. So he's also got some good stuff for Israel. So two things are happening. Lots of attention. It is negative attention to some degree, but it's attention nevertheless. And then scattered throughout is, but there will be a new day, and we'll get to some of that. So in a way, he's taking the end of his sermon and saying to the people, now don't misunderstand this. I am, for all the focus on you, It's like my son, after we played tennis for a couple of hours, said, well, I want to go. Oh, my God, I want to do something with your sisters. No, let's go out and get some ice cream. Okay, let's get some ice cream. Now I'm going to go home. No, let's take a little walk. Hey, by the way, it's not just about you. Even though I've been focusing on you here, there are lots of others in my purview. So it might be that Amos, again, is engaged in a rhetorical move in order to sort of level their sense of increasing uniqueness. I don't know. Don't you think that for an ancient book, this is a very exciting book, really, and it's very nuanced. Amos has a message, but he's qualifying it from time to time. Let's not be naive about this, even though I really mean what I'm saying about you. So, we say here these Torah study sessions can be from 9 to 10:30. I'm not good at ending on time. But I'm going to try, though, because we're trying to do this together. So Enid is here next week to lead us in a discussion. I hope you'll all come. It'll be a wonderful session, I know. I don't want to put any pressure on Enid. And then 2 weeks from today, we'll be back and we'll continue on Amos for a little while, and then we'll see what we're going to do next. Shabbat Shalom. Right. I know the answer to the candle question, but I can never get it straight. It has something to do with not lighting, not doing work on Shabbos, and lighting candles is work. So that we light the candles, if we were to say the blessing, see, it's something to do with that. So I light the candles, I close my eyes and say the blessing, I open them, the candles are lit, but I didn't do it on Shabbos. Okay. Something like that. I don't feel fully confident, like I said, but yeah. Closing your eyes for say the Shema. So,
second answer to the question.
Right. Right. So the rabbis say that there are certain prayers that have to be done with full kavanah, full intensity. And I think that, now I don't know how it gets from that to closing your eyes as an example. When closing your eyes, I might say shutting everything else out, is for certain prayers like the Shema, the acknowledgement of the oneness of God. Yeah.
We frequently tend to do very important points. Those are not matters. So that's your fix. I think that's part of our psychology. Question also.
That was question 1 and 2 parts. You're not saying I've got a bunch of questions. You're taking 1 and 2 and making them 1, so it doesn't look like a lot of questions.
They both have to do with the same. But you're right. I was taught that there was only one time that we was during the Avida. I was very carefully watching this because our friends were here. We're sitting in front of me. And I was watching the dinner. There are several times outside of the Avida when the rabbinate others genuflect.
That's a great question.
I was talking the only time we ever genuflected.
So I have a response. I'm not sure how good it is, but here it is. So it's true in the Amida, because the Amida is, think of the structure of the service. There's warm-ups, then you say the Baruch, which is, let's pray. So that's warm-ups. The Baruch, and then the Shema and all the blessings are kind of the ideological content of Judaism. Then comes the Amida, in which we enter the Holy of Holies. Now we're close to God. When you're close to God, you don't just step forward, you also step backwards. You also acknowledge. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam and so on. Then I step forward into the presence of God. When I'm about to leave, at the end of the meeting, I don't just say, see ya. I acknowledge that I'm your liege, I'm leaving, and I'm bowing, and so on. Then I'm stepping back forward in the sense that I'm returning to the service, but I've already acknowledged so that's the Amida. We also, in the Aleinu, but the Aleinu is we bow, and we bend and bow the knee, so we're actually doing that. V'anachnu korim, bend the knee. Umishtachavim, bow. Lifnei melech, before God. It's at that point that we stand up, because we're not servants of God. We're not supplicants. So that's that part of it, which is Aleinu specific. Then in the Kaddish, we also do it at the end. Oseh shalom b'mroma, oseh shalom, and so on. Why do we do it there? Oseh shalom. I don't have an explanation.
Are those now three supplications?
Well, you also have the Baruch. So a lot of people get this wrong in my view. Baruch is an imperative. Baruch et Adonai bara. Praise God. And a lot of people there do this, but we're not yet responding. We're just being told, praise God. Baruch Shem Kavod and so on. That's my response. So it's also there. It's also there.
It's 5 times.
It's a lot of times. We know what the Amida is.
Now, is that modern versus the way I was taught in the old shul and the Bulletzedek in Pittsburgh?
I'll bet they did most of this there. You don't think so? Whatever you were told, how did it happen, you know?
I don't know how I learned what I thought I had learned, but most of my traditional beliefs, or beliefs in tradition, came from those formative years when I would go to shul with my Seder. When we were visiting in Pittsburgh or living there for the summer. So most of it came from that setting.
And that's where you think you were told only twice, only once. Okay. You know, it's possible that, this idea of minhag, custom,
Well, that's what I was about to ask.
that's an easy out. Yeah, that's their custom, and this is our custom. But I think you're asking a more serious question. What are the what is there beyond custom that we can look to? You know that famous story where a rabbi retires and the congregation is now left on its own, and a couple of years later they're having a dispute about whether to stand for the Shema or sit for the Shema. They go back and forth. They can't resolve it. So let's go to the Rebbe who was, led us for all those years, and we'll ask him, what's the tradition? So they go to him, and he says, what's the question? They say, look, one group says that we should stand for the Shema, and the other group of us says we should be seated for the Shema. What's the tradition of the congregation? And he said,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
he said, that's the tradition. Arguing about it.
Yeah, okay. That's the best answer.
It's a good answer, isn't it? It's funny.
They were smart.
Oh, they were very smart. What were you going to say?
No, I was gonna make sure that I understood that you were talking about, you were talking about the tradition, but then all of a sudden you had added the words of the congregation.
Yes.
And that becomes a local custom versus a religious or a theological tradition.
All I was doing by that addition was to bring it
to that.
this specific
Yeah.
because I think what the rabbi was saying is it's the tradition not only for us. This is, that's why we love the joke, because we're all doing the same kind of thing.
Well, yeah, one of the biggest conversions that I had to make was accepting the fact that I now believe that those who don't do it are wrong. That during Isker, I was taught only the mourners stand and don't look at them. Now we all stand, and that was so hard for me to do when I first made the transition to a conservative shul. As an adult, because I always had in me.
Exactly. Those things are hard to break. Why should even one want to?
Now I understand, or at least I accept the fact that we all mourn.
And also, wives single out the mourners. Maybe they're embarrassed about standing and so on and so on. In a way, our concern for, etiquette, feelings, these are not bad things, have, in a way, compromised, softened some of the distinctive things.
But that's a movement-wide custom, habit, tradition.
And it's too bad in a way. I often say before I, in the service, ask people to rise. If you're observing Shiva, if you would like, please rise. I don't say do it, right? And I often say before that, one of the reasons we do this is to alert the congregation that these people have had a loss, and to go over and just rub their, even if you don't know them, I'm thinking about you, I'm sorry for your loss. That would be a big gain.
And yet, when we all stand and recite the Kaddish, we're doing exactly that. We're patting them on the shoulder out of respect for their loss.
But not individually.
Not individually, okay.
And that's what I need. Of course, thank you for the congregation for doing this, but I would like it if somebody came over and looked me in the eye and said, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And we've lost that a little bit. I'm going to think about the bowing part. Just Reform Judaism made a lot of changes, and now we're going back.
Yeah, well, you said it, I wasn't going to ask, but that's my observation. Over the years, we have become more and more conservadox.
I would say in ritual terms, more traditional. In ethical terms, more liberal. We've accepted gays and lesbians and so on. I'm sorry?
Why not?
Well, why not? Look, my brother, who I'm going to be spending some time with next week, sent me a responsum by a great conservative rabbi on the question of, do we accept homosexual marriage? And it's a long responsum because one of his premises, which he's trying to undermine, is there is long halachic Jewish tradition that even though this has nothing to do with their humanity or all of those things, but nevertheless, if we're going to embrace them, we have to acknowledge that the millennia of tradition against it, we just can't say what the Reform movement's, because the Reform movement treats Jewish law as illustrations, not as imperatives. Whereas the conservative movement, in a very interesting way, is caught in between the need to show the Orthodox, they wouldn't want me to say it this way, but that we're as halachic as you are, while also dealing with congregants who essentially are Reformed Jews. And that's what this guy is arguing. We've always reached our decisions by looking at the law. Let's look at what the people are doing, which is another move toward reform. But the conservative movement is shrinking because people are going over here and they're coming over here. Yeah. It's the problem of being a centrist movement.
I think that's a problem we're all facing in Congress.
Absolutely.
I used to call myself a left centrist. There's nothing left center.
No, it's really true. We hope the pendulum will swing again.
From your mouth. Oh, shame. Have a great trip.
Thank you so
Where are
much.
you going?
Well, my brother and I, for many years, Dennis went to Hobart, where Bob went. When our second parent died.
My daughter Jamie started at William Smith. Oh, that's interesting.
Here we go. Yeah. Well, I was just saying, I'm traveling with my brother, who went to Hobart, and I said that same as Bob, and
His daughter Jamie, William Smith, and I said, you should have went to it. So now let's get back to you and your brother.
okay. So our second parent died in 2006. We decided if we're going to keep our relationship alive, we got to do it ourselves. So for many years, we did Civil War sites, and we had a great time at it. Actually, one of the